Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall, speaking from Washington, D.C., the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Today, we have what I think is a fascinating and vitally important topic, and it will take the form of a conversation between me and my colleague and friend, Quentin Woden, who I'll introduce in a minute. And it is on the subject of Catholic education, in many ways an introduction to a huge and complex system. Some housekeeping details: the event is being recorded and it will be available to all who've registered on the Berkeley Center website and via email. And I do encourage a continuing discussion, but during the event, those of you who have questions or comments, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in questions, and we will get to as many as we can. So briefly, in the development world, the international development world, but also I think we could safely say in life, education is a vital issue, and it's obviously a central concern for Georgetown University as a whole, but also for the Berkeley Center. And we have had a continuing interest since we were founded in 2006 in issues of access to education, its quality, its relevance for people's lives, for civic values, and also as a part, for example, of conflict resolution. And we are acutely conscious of the disruptions of all education that have taken place during the COVID-19 crisis, with at least one estimate that at some stages 1.6 billion children were not in school. The Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental provider of basic education. And in the aggregate, especially, the scope of the services provided, trends and challenges and opportunities the Church confronts in providing these services are not as well understood as they should be. So that's the purpose of today's discussion, is to outline essentially what we know and what we don't know. Some of the evidence on what we're calling the global footprint of the Church, the Catholic Church, in the education sector, and some issues that raises. So this conversation will focus on the diversity of the education that the Church provides, some challenges and opportunities associated with that fact. The implications of the COVID-19 crisis are another topic that we will be exploring. My colleague Quentin Woden has a long career at the World Bank, where he works on issues of education, but also health, social protection. And he's led at different times the work of faith roles in different sectors. So he and I have held similar positions in the past. And he also leads a global Catholic education project on his own, which he will explain. And he's produced annual reports on the state of Catholic education. Quentin has asked me not to be very expansive about his background and his role, but I do have to mention that remarkable fact that he has 4 PhDs and is finishing a 5th. He served as president of 2 economics associations and has more than 500 publications. And he does a lot of volunteer work, but throughout his life and career, his focus is sharply on poverty reduction, including on education. So with that, let me turn to Quentin. We've agreed to have a conversation, so I might even interrupt him at some stages, or he can correct and interrupt me, which he has done in the past. But let's start by exploring the Catholic education system. Could you sort of give us some grist on the overall system, some basic statistics and trends, globally, by region? Where are there areas of growth? Where are there contraction? Tell us a little bit about essentially what we know and what we don't.
Thank you, Catherine. And if I ever interrupted you, I'm sorry. So anyway, yes. So
I said corrected. You corrected
okay,
me.
okay. So as you said, I mean, the Catholic Church is the largest provider of education as well as health and social protection services in the world, the non-governmental provider. For education, the church actually publishes every year a statistical yearbook, and according to the data from the church, but those data seem actually pretty reasonable, about 62 million children in the world are enrolled in pre-primary, primary, and secondary education. And for tertiary education, it's almost 7 million. So that is extremely large. Maybe I should say a few patterns in that. The enrollment in what we call in the US K-12 education has about doubled over the last 40 years. Now, the market share of Catholic education, and I know Catholic scholars don't like too much to speak about market shares, but I'll use the term, is actually not that large. It's about 5% for primary and 3% for secondary education globally. So sometimes people feel like faith-based providers are providing half or sometimes more of education and health services in the world. That is not correct. It might be correct in a few countries, but not overall. However, especially in low-income countries, and that includes especially Africa, the Catholic Church and some others are very important players. About 1 in 7 students in a primary school in a low-income country is actually in a Catholic school. And in Africa, more than 10% of children in primary education are in Catholic schools. So the largest country is India, but that we know because of the size of the country. But after that, the next 4 countries with the largest number of students in Catholic education are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Kenya, and Malawi. And so one key fact, if you will, for Catholic education globally is the rise of Africa. And this is expected to continue. Right now, Africa represents, for example, more than half of the students in Catholic schools, Catholic primary schools. And if trends continue, and there is all the reasons to believe that those trends will continue, the share of the students in Catholic schools, especially at the primary and progressively at the secondary level, who live in low-income countries, and especially in Africa, is going to continue to increase. And I believe that this has quite some impact or some importance for how we think about what we need to be done. I just want to mention, although most people here would know it, because I guess most of the participants are from the US, that in the US, the number of children in Catholic schools has been decreasing for about 50 years. But we can go back to that and why that would be the case. So in summary, a very large network of schools, and especially growing and especially important in low-income countries, and again, in particular, in Africa.
Quentin, the pattern, the sort of map, if you look at it, of Catholic education, schools at different levels, et cetera, is quite varied. Can you comment a bit on the historic factors, but also the contemporary factors that explain a little bit why Catholic education is so important in some countries, less important in others, and that's not necessarily correlated with the religious affiliations, but more, my hunch is, with history.
Well, it's both, right? It's correlated with religious affiliation, and of course, there's a huge historical factor. And within that historical factor, we would include what are the state regulations. For example, does the state actually fund Catholic education? So I mentioned the US, right? I mean, the US is actually a bit of an outlier in terms of the fact that Catholic schools benefit from almost no funding in the US. I mean, there are a few voucher programs in different states or school choice programs, but by and large, the Catholic schools have to rely on the funding, the tuition cost from parents to survive. And that has contributed actually to lower enrollment over time for a number of reasons in Catholic education at the K-12 level in the US. I mean, just to mention that both income levels and faith matter. If you do a map, a scatter plot, right, where you would have the different states in the US and the market share of Catholic schools in those different states, and you relate that to the share of Catholics, you will have a positive slope, right? So the market share is clearly much higher in the states that have a higher share of Catholics. But then if you do another scatter plot and you would show the level of income of the states, right, the standards of living of the states, and the share, again, of students in Catholic schools, you will have the same upper trend. And that's because of the out-of-pocket cost, right? So states that have higher income levels tend to have more parents who are able to afford Catholic schools in the States. Now, in other countries, it's completely different, right? So in my country, Belgium, the constitution actually states that funding for public or different types of schools, Catholics, Protestant, Jewish, whatever, I mean, should be essentially equal. It's not completely equal, but that means that in my country, there is zero cost for a parent to send a child to Catholic school, and that leads to a market share which is much, much, much higher, about half or more, right? Now, the historical factor, one of the important ones apart from religions or levels of income and so on, is the conflict issue, right? And when you were at the World Bank, you mentioned that very rightfully so, is that the footprint or the role that faith-based providers, including the Catholic Church, play in conflict-affected or post-conflict countries tends to be larger, and that was partly due to a collapse of the state. And the church and others essentially provided services at some point that the state was not able to. So there are different factors depending on where you are, but for example, Congo or Sierra Leone or other countries tend to have a larger share of faith-based and especially Catholic schools, in part because of those historical settings. And by the way, I mentioned the World Bank. I should say that whatever I say today is in my personal capacity and not as a World Bank staff. Thank you.
We're speaking from a Jesuit university. Clearly, the impact and the role in higher education has particular importance. Could you comment on some of those trends and patterns, and maybe even how they compare with the K-12, because they are somewhat different profiles and roles, I think?
Yes, actually, it is strikingly different. What is going on still today for higher education versus basic education, K-12. So actually, 7 in 10 children who are in a Catholic school, K-12 today, are living in the low or lower middle income countries, right, with a specific set of issues. And by contrast, 7 in 10 students who are in a Catholic university live in an upper middle or high income countries, right? So it's completely different, the picture in both sides. And that is not expected to change very quickly either. Now, what the challenges that universities face, including in the US, are probably less related to the issue of funding as to the broader trend towards secularization, however you want to define secularization, right? Now, Catholic schools or Catholic universities, for example, in the US, which is a very interesting case because the US has more than 200 Catholic colleges and universities. That's the only country with so many different choices among Catholic universities, right? But there is a cost, and the cost is higher than in the public sector, but since you still have to pay for part of your education, even in the public sector, the difference is a bit lower. Now, what I find very interesting, and I don't know whether that responds directly to your question, is why do students choose Catholic universities versus public or other types of universities? And for that, as always, the US tends to have very good data. There's actually a survey which is called the CIRP Freshman Survey that is implemented every year. And you can see that at a broad level, the choice of a Catholic university is not related to Catholic identity. But I'll come back to that, right? The main reason why students go to Catholic universities in the US is academic reputation, employment prospects. the fact that they get financial assistance, academic reputation of the major that they choose, extracurricular activities. College size is a very interesting one because many Catholic universities are smaller than some of the other ones. Now, none of that is related to faith or the fact that some students are Catholic. A bit less than half, I think, of students, or about half of students in Catholic universities in the US are Catholic. But when you go a bit deeper in the detail, then the Catholic identity comes in, because when you look at the differences in the reasons why students choose non-Catholic universities and those who choose Catholic universities, their faith affiliation plays a role. So I don't want to say that faith affiliation does not matter, but there are other things that may matter even more. But for differentiation, of course, it matters.
I'm going to pick up on one of the questions. We have questions already coming in, and I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box. But this one is asking specifically about what some of the patterns are in Latin America. And since you focused quite a bit on Africa, I think it would be interesting to look at Latin America.
So I would have to actually to look at the details of the countries, right? But broadly speaking, Latin America, if you will, in terms of the broad growth or lack of growth, right, of enrollment, is a little bit in between Africa and North America / Europe, right? So North America is the outlier where you have a strong decline in the K-12 enrollment, right? In Latin America, the enrollment differs a lot between the countries, and that has to do, again, in part, to issues of financing, but it's still growing, right? But not as much as in Africa, right? In Europe, it's pretty flat, actually, over time, right? Now, what I find interesting about Latin America, more than some of the broad trends, are some of the particular experiences. And I mean, you know, Fe Alegria, which is a network of Jesuit schools, and that's an especially interesting experience, not only in terms of the size of the network. I mean, they are present in many countries with quite many schools. I forgot the exact numbers, but I think somebody told me recently it was 5,000 schools. I'm not sure. But they are really trying to serve, at least to some extent, children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that is not something that is always very easy to do, especially if there is an out-of-pocket cost for parents to send their child to Catholic schools. But there are a number of interesting practices that Fe Alegria schools have that have made them quite successful in ensuring good educational outcomes, right? So I wanted to mention them in particular because they are a very interesting experience outside of the normal, if you will, national networks that you typically have in the different countries.
Great. One of the big issues for education globally, in a sense, after so much progress has been made in access, there are so many issues on quality. And it is both sort of the simple quality, whether people learn to read and to compute, but more broadly, the depth of teaching people to think, introducing them to civic values, etc. What do we know about the quality, performance, shall we say, of Catholic schools? How varied is it, and what seems to make the difference?
That is a complicated question, but I mean, Catholic schools have the reputation of being good schools, right? And some schools are very, very good schools, right? Many countries have among the top schools a few Catholic schools, right? I mean, and I think that is correct. At the same time, one should not overstate the difference on average in the quality of the education that you get in the Catholic schools versus another school, right? And let me mention, I mean, two cases, and the second one I think is especially interesting. But the first one is the US, and most of the research on what is called the Catholic advantage is in the US, right? And if you look at the very basic data, even without controlling for the characteristics of the students who enroll in Catholic schools, I mean, you see that in the national assessments, Catholic schools do a little bit better. What is important is that that little bit better is mostly that you have fewer children who do very badly, right? And that's very important. And that's a confirmation of the Catholic schools. But when you look at the performance of Catholic schools controlling for who enrolls, most of the studies find some difference. The Catholic schools do better on standardized tests or measures like that. Some studies find no difference. So overall, I think that there is a Catholic school advantage for purely academic performance, but it's not very large, right? And I'll come back to the non-academic aspects, but let me give you an example now for Uganda, and I found that very interesting when I got the data. So this is a survey that was actually implemented by the World Bank, and in Uganda, you have a very large number of Catholic schools, right? So you can actually observe them in the data now. So we were able actually to identify the Catholic schools. What's interesting is that you have Catholic public schools and you have Catholic private schools. And then you have non-Catholic public schools and non-Catholic private schools, right? So you can compare whether, for example, the Catholic public schools do better than the other public schools. They do not. You can compare whether the Catholic private schools do better than the other private schools. They do not. But the private schools, Catholic or not, do better than the public schools, right? And so this is just one example. And I think it's important when we state some broad conclusions to be very, very careful, not to overstate from an academic point of view the school advantage, if you will, or the Catholic advantage that is called in literature. Now, there is one other thing though that I wanted to mention. And again, here we have to be very careful about the context. But in the US, it's very interesting that when you look at other aspects, right? I'm talking here about violence in school, or trust of the child in the teachers, or health indicators about the well-being of the child. There is actually a pretty systematic difference between religious schools on the one hand and public schools on the other hand, with religious schools doing systematically better, even after controlling for what you can control for in those data. So what I'm trying to say here is that in some contexts, the identity of the school, and I think it's broader than Catholic, in this case, the data is for religious schools, tends to be associated with a number of indicators for child well-being that are better. And that controls for income, for example, but not for everything. So we have to be careful. Now, somebody did a very nice evaluation of a project in Uganda, or an intervention in Uganda, which is called the Good Toolkit program. It's Karen De Vries, actually, her name. But they were able to show a very nice interventions to reduce violence in schools, improving well-being, a lot of things, right? And I asked her, can you disaggregate your data in terms of the level of violence and the levels of well-being and different variables that they had by type of faith-based organizations and in public schools? And then in Uganda, you didn't see that. You didn't see the same difference as you saw in the US, right? So again, that might be because most of the Ugandan Catholic schools are actually public schools and not that different from the other public schools. But I think we have to be very, very nuanced in what we say. And I took too long, sorry, to respond to this, Catherine. But so I would say overall, I mean, there is an impression and there is some data to suggest that Catholic schools do better. And I think that that advantage is probably larger for the non-academic than the academic, right? But again, it depends a lot on the specific context of the country.
So it's complicated. As all these,
it depends on local context. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But why would a parent choose, if they have a choice, which of course they don't always, to send their child to a Catholic school or to a public school? What seemed to be, what do we know about that? And what is significant in your mind, including, I guess, the financial side, but some of the other aspects as well?
Right. So I mean, I did two studies on that, and one is for Africa, and the other one is for the US. And so let me mention both. In Africa, that was a few years ago. I mean, we did detailed work, qualitative and small sample surveys in two countries, Burkina Faso and Ghana, to try to understand why do parents send their children to a public school or a Christian school or an Islamic school, And we chose Burkina Faso and Ghana because those are countries where you have a mix of religions, right? You have actually all of them fairly well represented. And what we found was that for Islamic schools, the reason to send a child to the Islamic schools was primarily religious, right? And the parents valued a lot the religious instructions. And these were, by the way, schools that also provide secular topics, right? It's not a Quranic school, right? So it is an Islamic school. And so the religious instructions and the link with the mosque and other aspects were the key for the parents to send their children there. For those sending their children to Catholic or Protestant schools, there were two key advantages, if you will, or comparative advantages. The main one was academics, and that goes back to what I said before, right? Is that in many countries, the Catholic schools tend to be pretty good schools, right? Now, the second reason was values. The parents were saying that values, not faith, values were emphasized more, right, in those schools. And then for public schools, it was either cost or proximity that led the parents to choose those. So you have very clear comparative advantages, if you will, for some of the parents of the Christian and the Islamic schools. Now in the US, and that's my second example, there is a very nice survey that was collected by NCEA, that's the National Catholic Educational Association in the US, about 3-4 years ago, to try to better understand the motivations for the parents to send their children to Catholic schools. And so, I mean, there are lots of findings from that survey, but there is one in particular that I found very interesting, and it actually then begs questions for the schools afterwards in terms of policy, right, or what they emphasize. So one of the questions was asking, out of these 9 things that children could learn in schools, what is for you the most important? And the parents could choose 3 of the 9, right? And of the 9, 5 were related to skills, right? I mean, preparing oneself for the labor market, preparing oneself for college, being a good communicator, different skills, right? And 4 were related to values and faith. One of the 4 was faith, and the other 3 were diversity, getting strong values, etc. When you do look at the data, you can see that for the parents who do not send their children to Catholic schools, right, the 5 that are about skills are always on the top, right, much more than the values. And when you look at the parents who send their children to Catholic schools, there's actually equality between the 5 which are skills and the 4 that are values, right? So there's a very strong dichotomy here. But then it begs the question in terms of what you want to emphasize. And one of the things I want to mention is that that survey suggests for the parents, right, who have their child in Catholic schools, right, faith actually, that was one of the 4 related to values, came up pretty high, right? But if you look at another sample, which is the parents who considered enrolling their child in Catholic schools, but did not send their child to a Catholic school, faith ranks very low, but values ranks high, right? And that's a little bit of a dilemma in terms of what you emphasize. Do you emphasize faith per se, or do you emphasize values more generally in a context in the US of declining enrollment, right? So, I mean, we don't have the answer here to that question. It's a complicated question again, but you see very clearly differences in the emphasis that parents place on different things that children could learn in school.
We have a couple of questions that have come in that follow a little bit from this, or follow from this, which is in Muslim majority communities or Muslim majority countries. What are the factors involved in choosing Catholic education or emphasizing it? And I think it would also be interesting, what are the government policies? How is that influencing the way that the Catholic education system is developing and changing, as well as its origins?
So my impression is that in majority Muslim countries, the main reason to send your child to a Catholic school is that combination of strong academics and values, right? I did mention before, I mean, that If you look at countries like the DRC or Sierra Leone or some of the countries where the Catholic networks of schools is huge, right? In the DRC, I mean, a lot of students are going to Catholic schools. Same for Sierra Leone and a few other countries the same. I mean, it's normal that the difference in the student performance, right, is not very large between public and Catholic schools. It couldn't be, right? But in those Muslim countries, you have much smaller networks of Catholic schools, and they tend to be pretty good, right? And so academics and the emphasis on values is very important. I mean, as part of my volunteer work for the Global Catholic Education Project, I just finished a series of interviews a month ago or so with Catholic education leaders in 15 African and Middle East countries. So you have a few from the Middle East, Tunisia, Lebanon, there were two others. And the relationship with the state is actually pretty good in most cases. Some get funding, some do not get any funding. So it really depends on each of the country, right? But on your question as to motivation, I think it's really the strong academics and then the importance on values. I mean, in some cases, I mean, one of them was mentioning foreign languages as something that they paid special attention in their school, right? Which is related to academic quality in a way, right? I hope I answered your questions broadly, at least.
Philip Fernandez raises an interesting question that when he went to a Catholic missionary school, the Muslims who were attending tended to be rich and connected. And is that an overall pattern? Is that changing? Essentially that there is an elite dimension to the patterns.
Again, it's very country specific, right? In the countries where the Catholic schools do not benefit from public funding, and thereby you have an out-of-pocket cost for parents, whether you're looking at the Muslim or the Catholics who enrolled in the schools on average, they tend to come up from privileged backgrounds, even if the schools are trying to make efforts to welcome low-income students as well, right? But in other countries where the Catholic schools do benefit from public funding, that is not necessarily the case, right? I mean, I did a few years ago, and I'm updating that work with new surveys, that was for Africa, but comparison of the cost of attending Catholic schools or actually faith-based schools broadly, and comparing that to the cost of attending public schools versus the cost of attending private schools. And what you find very systematically in most of the countries is that the faith-based schools are more expensive than the public schools, but much less expensive than the other private schools, right? But again, it depends a lot on the country specifics, right?
One of the questions, obviously, for both universities, but even for schools, is what roles the alumni play, the networks, essentially, that these schools can fuel or can feed, depending on how you look at it. What could you say about that phenomenon and some of the issues associated?
So I must admit that I cheated here because I did ask Catherine to ask me that question because I think it's very important as a question. So she could ask me many other questions, but I asked her, please ask me that question. And so I don't have a perfect answer, of course, but the alumni are extremely important, right? And I think that both Catholic schools and to some extent Catholic universities do not do enough to try to keep contact and engage their alumni. And I asked her to ask me that question because of the US and because of a very specific aspect of the US here. So if you look at the US, of course, for the universities, I mean, you have a tradition, right, which is much stronger in the US than I think anywhere else in the world, of trying to keep contact with the alumni and asking for donations and things like that, right? And so I believe there is less of an issue for universities in terms of keeping in touch with the alumni than there is for the K-12 sector, where that is less the case, right? But here is the specificity for the US, right? Now, I mentioned that for 50 years, enrollment in K-12 schools in the US has declined, right? It's a bit below 2 million now. It used to be almost 6 million, right? So what that means is that the number of alumni per student in a Catholic school is higher in the US than in any other place in the world, right? I computed those numbers. I mean, I still have to check them. But this is a unique opportunity, not only to try to get donations, but to also try to get alumni involved in a range of programs, right? And one of the things that Pope Francis has been advocating for, and I'm sure most of our participants know that under the Global Compact for Education, is that education does not happen only in the school, but the link with the community and what happens outside of the school is extremely important. And to me, the alumni represent a wonderful potential that should be exploited much more systematically. Now, I want to say one last thing on that is that in many countries, you have a national association of alumni of Catholic education, both K-12 and higher, right? And then you have regional association. There's one for Latin America, and you have a global one. And the name is OMAEC, for those who don't know that association. There is no association in the US. That means that there is no real easy mean in the US to try to share experiences on how to best engage alumni. And if anybody wants to think about that, I would be happy to talk to you, because I think that's a priority, especially for K-12. And especially, again, because the US is the country probably in the world with the highest ratio of alumni to students in K-12 schools. And that could be a wonderful resource for many different projects.
Well, we have a lot of questions coming in. Some of them are specific to areas and some of them are general, but just so that we set the stage a little bit, can you tell us a little bit about what the Global Catholic Education Project is and what it's doing? And I think an underlying question and a reason why we're having this event today is to identify a bit more clearly what we know, but also what are some of the gaps in knowledge? What are the areas where we need to do more work and more analysis?
Right. So on the Global Catholic Education, this is a volunteer-led project, which I started in November last year. And I started it after talking with the four main international organizations that represent Catholic education globally. And those organizations are OIEC, which stands for the International Office of Catholic Education. That's for K-12 schools. Many of you might know IFCU, which is the International Federation of Catholic Universities. The third one is OMAEC, which I mentioned. That's the Association internationally for the alumni of Catholic education. And then there is one last one, which is called UMEC in French. It's CUT in English, which is the Teachers Association, if you will, right? And so I started that project for two reasons. I mean, the first one was to try to make the world and the experience of Catholic education better known in the international community. And that's why I started to do those reports that you mentioned, what I call the Global Catholic Education Report. We have done two so far. And very soon I'm going to try to finalize something a bit broader, and I'm calling it the Global Report on Integral Human Development. So hopefully in a few weeks, I'll have the full draft and we can release it in October. But so the objective of those reports is in part to make the word of Catholic education and more broadly Catholic service delivery in education, health, and social protection better known from the international community. Because, as you know better than I do, Catherine, the international community is not very sympathetic right now, said large, about the role that faith-based schools and others could play. So that's one role. But the other role is to try to make the world of the international community and all the research that is done by many people on K-12 or universities or whatever it is, better known to Catholic education and Catholic educators, right? And I mean, again, everything I say today is in just my personal, I represent only myself, but I work at the World Bank, and I know that at the World Bank, we make a lot of efforts to share analysis with national networks of schools, governments. We don't have the same tradition of sharing that with the faith-based schools, for example, right? And so there's a richness of material that is available and that we need to make more accessible. And I just, as an example of what we are doing, actually, and anybody can contact me through the Global Catholic Education website. You go to contact us, send me an email. but with a collaborative which is called GRACE, that is Global Researchers Advancing Catholic Education. It's 5 universities per SOIEC, or 4 per SOIEC. We are going to organize in the next few months a series of webinars for Catholic educators in Africa, right? And again, with the aim of sharing good practices. Some of it on Catholic identity, but most of it is actually about how to improve teaching and learning, right? So that's the goal of the Global Catholic Education Project. 2 goals: to make the world of Catholic education and what the church provides in broader services better known in the international community, and then to bring the research that is done out there to the Catholic educators, right? And then you asked me a second question, and then I embarked on this, and I forgot the second question.
Well, it's basically, what are the gaps, and what do you think we need to know? I mean, I know that in Nigeria, for example, the status of Catholic education is complex, partly because it was originally created under the colonial era, but then schools were nationalized, then some were denationalized, then a new set have been established. Some of the orders have established systems. I was struck that a Catholic cardinal, when I asked him if he could give me a sort of primer, basically said, no, I can't, it's too complicated. So to me, having a fundamental understanding of how the systems work, and actually there's one question that suggests or asks, do you have extremes of truly excellent and truly horrible, I guess, Catholic schools that might come out of that kind of a complex history? So sorry, I'm giving some of my own sort of thoughts on that, but the basic question is, where is research needed? Where are big gaps in knowledge, and where is the knowledge, as you were just suggesting, simply not made available? In other words, people have the knowledge, but it's not properly diffused and taken into account.
Right. I mean, there are quite a few knowledge gaps in many areas, right? But I mean, if I were to choose a few, I mean, you mentioned the whole issue of what's the relationship between the state and Catholic networks of schools, but the same relationship is probably the case with Islamic networks or some other networks, right? And that has to do with, is there state funding? Are there state regulations? How are they? And so on. And one of the products that I hope to finalize, but I've said that for a few months and I still haven't finalized it, is actually a study of the regulatory frameworks, because I did a survey more than a year ago on that with the leaders of Catholic education networks in about 50 countries. So so trying to understand how are those relationships happening, and then trying to understand what makes sense given the context of different countries, right? I mean, some countries actually fund Catholic schools and other faith-based schools in the same way than they do public schools. Some countries, and that would be an outlier, the US, do not, and many countries are in between. And so what makes sense, right? And what are the legitimate conditions that the state could impose on Catholic schools to provide funding? Because it cannot be a one-way stream, right? So it has to be a negotiation, and there might be legitimate things that a state can require a school that it funds to do. So for example, I mean, one could argue that if a Catholic school gets funding from the state, it has to be willing to accept anybody. You don't have to be Catholic to go to the schools, right? I mean, that would be one example. Now, to me, though, apart from that, the most important thing perhaps is trying to do some more detailed work, including quantitative work, on what works well in Catholic schools, right? And I did mention before, taking the case of the US, because that's where we have more data, that in several dimensions, the religious schools as a whole, it's not necessarily the Catholic schools, and tend to do better than the public schools. And then to me, the interesting question is why? Why is that? So why is it that the level of violence is lower? Why is it that students score a bit better on civic knowledge and engagement, right? Why is it that when you look at the trajectory of the children later on in life, some of the trajectories may be different? And here the point is actually not at all, I think, to say, oh, Catholic schools may be doing a bit better or religious schools may be doing a bit better. The question is to understand what are some of the practices there that then can be replicated elsewhere, including in public schools, right? So that everybody improves, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of research on Catholic education, actually, but I think sometimes we would need more research that is a bit less on the Catholic identity per se of the schools and more on some of their broader characteristics, so that we can learn really what works, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about RCTs, right? Randomized controlled trials, which are sometimes difficult and expensive to do. I mean, they are needed, but there's a lot that we can do with the existing data, and I think we should do more of that. And then the last thing I want to mention is most of the audience today is probably from American universities or American institutions. I think there's a fundamental question for universities and institutions that are Catholic, is how do they help? So how do Georgetown University, to take an example, right, help for K-12 schools in the US or for schools in the developing world, or even for universities in the developing world? I mean, I'm sure you're doing a number of things. I don't know what it is, but there is, in the US especially, because there is such a concentration of knowledge, right, and an extremely strong Catholic sector. How do we make sure that that sector at the university level supports K-12 in the US, but also Catholic education globally, because there is nobody with the same concentration of knowledge and even financing and ability to set up things than here in the US. So there's a special responsibility here, I believe.
That's an important point. There are a lot of questions, so I'm going to throw three at you and see what you can make of them. Dominique Lallemand, who's our friend and colleague also, in Latin America, there's a network of Jesuit universities. Do you have any data comparing the performance of these universities in various fields of studies, such as engineering, liberal arts, with public universities? And I'm going to throw the two others at you. One is, what do you know, what's known, what are issues specific to Catholic education in India? And then someone else is asking about trends in Europe, which I think you've already mentioned, but you might elaborate, and Canada.
All right, so I mean, there's no way to respond to all of that, right? But I can perhaps give a few examples. I mean, I don't have data for Latin America on the performance of Catholic universities. There is a bit of data that comes from the International Federation of Catholic Universities, and they were very nice to share it. I haven't done much with it yet, about the characteristics of the students in some of those universities, and the priorities of the students in some of those universities. And I think that's important to analyze a bit more. There was one survey in 2012, there's another one from 2017, that's the last one, to try to understand how Catholic universities can learn from that, right? And some of the broad messages that I shared for the US in terms of the motivations of the students and so on, I mean, we have some data like that for Latin America as well. On Latin America, the only detailed technical work I had done, but that's about 10 years ago, was about Fe Alegria schools. And I was trying to estimate how well they were doing, and we had a wonderful data set from Colombia. What we found from Colombia actually was that they were on par with other schools, but what was interesting is that our Fe Alegria counterparts were very happy about that, and because they were thinking that they were doing worse. And that was in part because in Colombia, actually, quite a few of the children that they were reaching were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So they were happy about the results. There has been other studies of Fe Alegria with K-12 schools that shows actually with randomized controlled trials, a better performance, and quite significant in one of the countries. So that's for Latin America. Now, you asked about India. I mean, I don't know enough about India. I mean, my wife is Indian. I mean, she's Hindu. She actually went to a Catholic school when she was at university, and I think even before. I mean, the Catholic schools in India tend to do fairly well, in part because I mean, I mean, you have to pay the out-of-pocket fee, right? And so I think, although I don't have the detailed data, that they tend to cater to better off students. In terms of the universities in India, what's interesting is that after the US, that's the second country with the largest numbers of Catholic universities. But there's a bit of a difference in India, in the sense that you also have a lot of Catholic higher institutes, which are not universities. And this is very different from the US, right? In the US, almost all of the university students all of the tertiary education students go to universities. In India, it's very different. I mean, there's a lot of non-university higher institutes providing education. And so the reality of those might be a bit different from the universities. I mean, Europe is like India. I mean, in India, each state is different. In Europe, each country is different, right? You have Ireland, where historically almost 9 in 10 students are in Catholic schools, right? And then you have other countries where it's 1 in 10. I mean, it would be a bit complicated to go into the details of the different countries. But the main question, I think, from my discussion with people who manage the European networks is that the issue of secularization and how to make sure that Catholic schools are actually different, that they have their own identity, comes up very, very strongly. But I don't know if this is enough details, but it's very difficult to go into the different countries one by one.
We're not going to be able to respond to all the questions because we're now at 9 minutes left. But the one question that was suggested by someone and that I'd be interested in is how much you have seen of an approach that looks at the interreligious relationships. Are there examples of Catholic schools, for example, working with schools of other religious traditions? Could be Muslim, could be Presbyterian, could be Buddhist. And how far is there interesting, significant work on interreligious relationships, social cohesion issues?
Right. I'm glad you asked that question, actually. So, I mean, this is still as part of my volunteer work, but I'm putting together a few special issues of journals. One is about the performance of Catholic schools in non-academic criteria. That's for an American journal. Another one is about Africa and case studies of faith-based education in Africa. And the last one is about this. So I'm doing a special issue on Catholic education and pluralism for another journal in the US. And by the way, if any of you have something that you have ready in your drawer, send it to me, and I'm happy to look at it. But these are going to be finalized very soon, those very special issues. And one great example, or two examples that I want to mention for the question that you asked me, right? Which I put under the category of pluralism, right? Mm-hmm. There is this priest in Burkina Faso. His name is Alexandre Bingo. So I mean, a new school was created at the secondary level about 2,000 years ago or so, and it's completely in a Muslim area. So most of the students are Muslim, right? And he's doing a lot of very practical things in the school, right, to encourage mutual support between the Muslim students and the Catholic students or Christian students, and also to make sure that religion and spirituality is really valued and emphasized, but in a way that works for the Muslim students who are the majority of the students, right? And I found that example really, really interesting. And another example that I want to give is a friend from many years ago in Belgium, who created a new Jesuit school in a neighborhood of Brussels, the capital of Belgium, which is mostly Muslim, right? And we were chatting actually a few days ago because he's also doing a paper for that special issue, hopefully, right, on Catholic education and pluralism. And he was expressing, and I don't think I'm saying something which I shouldn't say, that when he was thinking about doing this new project, right, and talking with the Jesuits, because it's a Jesuit school, they said, well, we don't want to create another 15th or 16th Jesuit school like all of these Jesuit schools that we have in Belgium, right? I mean, what would be the point, right? And those schools have been very successful. He was telling me that half of the prime ministers of Belgium over time come from those few schools, okay? But what they decided was to create a school specifically to serve an undeserved, disadvantaged population, and in a majority Muslim area of the city. And that school has been operating for a few years, and now they're replicating that elsewhere. So there are a number of very interesting experiences. And last thing I would say, and you can read those interviews because they are online on the Global Catholic Education website. When I interviewed the heads of Catholic school networks in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Tunisia, and I had a fourth country, I forgot what it was. All of them were very, very engaged in making sure that their school can actually serve the Muslim population and what this entails, right? So I think that it's one of the interesting characteristics of Catholic schools is that students should be feeling welcome from any background, right? And that's actually one of the emphasis also of the key document on Catholic education from the Congregation of Catholic Education that says that actually the mission of the school is to go to those who are the periphery, and that includes the periphery of the faith.
There are a lot of very interesting questions. So Quentin, I will pass them all on to you later, and we can see how far we can either learn from them or actually try to answer them. But let me end. We have 4 more minutes. And so in your conclusions, here are 3 tough and interesting questions that come up. One of them is that there are countries we know where education for girls is problematic. There's one that's rather prominent on our radar screens right now. Interested in how Catholic education, the Catholic Church, is addressing some of these situations. What's their stance? That's the first question. Dominique comes in with a humdinger, which is the information on pedophilia, which has plagued the Catholic Church, the main factor accounting for the decline in attendance of Catholic schools, at least in the US, and how is information on that kind of abuse in Canada, she's pointing out, being treated. And then the third, from Dr. Inan Schenker, draws on the experience with the HIV/AIDS crisis and thinking about AIDS education, which has been a big issue. And so he's wondering whether we have any data on how Catholic Christian schools are introducing education based on the COVID crisis and vaccination into curricula. So those are 3, which could keep us for another hour, but you have 3 minutes.
Okay, all right. So I have not done any specific work on Catholic schools and HIV/AIDS, so I will drop that one because I don't really know, right?
No, but he's asking about COVID.
Oh, he's asking about COVID. So what is the question then again?
Well, based on the experience of HIV/AIDS, are there any initiatives that are specifically focused on the COVID crisis?
Okay. I don't know about the initiatives focused on the COVID crisis. What I did, and I can share those results again, contact me by email, and you can do it through the Global Catholic Education website, is I did a small survey on trying to assess the impact of the COVID crisis on Catholic schools specifically. And some of the data is in the Global Catholic Education Report 2021. But on the other 2, so one was girls' education, and the second one was sexual abuse, which is part of the broader issue of violence against children, right? So 2 things. So on girls' education, the Catholic Church actually is doing a lot. And one of the best examples is the FMA Sisters. That's the largest congregation of sisters in the world. I mean, they're operating schools all over the place, as well as a few universities. I mean, they're doing very interesting things, right? And we have interviews with a half dozen of them that we made available recently through the Global Catholic Education Project. Now, what I would love to do on girls' education is this, and I just finished something as part of my other volunteer hat yesterday with Rotary. So I did a report, and I can share the draft if you want, for anybody who is interested, about examples of projects supported by Rotary for girls' education and empowerment all over the world. And I added an investment case study based on work on the World Bank and some good practice on how to invest in girls' education. Because sometimes what we need to do is what some people think we need to do. There's actually, so for example, the issue of learning right, is absolutely fundamental, right? For girls' education, we often emphasize social norms, and I've done a lot of work on child marriage and girls' education at the World Bank. Social norms do matter, right? But for many countries, what leads the most girls to drop out is not the social norms at the secondary level, because that happens already in those African countries where enrollment is extremely low, right? It is lack of learning at the primary level, right? So if we are fixing the lack of learning at the primary level, including in some Catholic schools, I mean, we would get a lot of progress for girls' education. But I would love to have case studies of what different Catholic schools are doing and to put that together, because I don't think actually it exists. And so if you have anything or want to talk about that, I will help you. And then on the issue of violence, and I have 1 minute, I guess, I can tell you that this is going to be a core topic of the Integral Human Development Network, the Integral Human Development Report that I'm trying to finalize within the next few weeks. We don't have good data on sexual abuse in Catholic schools per se. We have some data on sexual abuse in schools overall, and that is through DHS surveys. It tends to be underestimated, but it's still, I mean, 1 or 2% probably. That's the estimation we get. It could be much higher. We do have quite a bit of data of other forms of violence, and I just finalized at the World Bank a report. It's available on the web. It's called Ending Violence: An Investment Case, that looks at different types of violence and what we can do about it, right? And again, to me, this is an example of how we could inform the world about what's happening in some of the Catholic schools or universities sometimes, but Catholic schools and universities need to be informed of the evidence that comes from great evaluation and innovations on how to reduce violence in schools, whether it's programs in Uganda or in the United States. And so one of my priorities is to try to work on that. And again, if anybody wants more details, I'm happy to share the World Bank study that we finalized at the end of July, specifically on that topic.
Great. Well, we've come, unfortunately, to the end of a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Quentin. I think you're a treasure box of information and ideas. And we appreciate you sharing it with us. And thank you to the very lively audience. There were far more questions than we could get to, but it sparks thinking and gives us ideas on where to move next. So thank you all so much. The recording will be available soon and will be available on the website. And as I promised, we will take a hard look at your wonderful questions. So thank you very much.